Hi everyone, this is Katie with Katie Loves Classic Books, and I'm here today with my January wrap-up. So, let's start with the first book I read this year, and that was The Magic Toy Shop by Angela Carter, and this was published in 1967, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. This is definitely a new favorite book of mine. So, this book is definitely not what you would think it is based on the title. So, it's about a girl named Melanie. It's kind of about her coming of age and coming into the world as a woman into a world that is kind of confusing and dark and foreboding for women, and coming into her sexuality. So the book starts out with one of the most wonderful scenes I have read in a while, where Melanie is first coming into her own and she's exploring her body, and she spends time alone in her room pretending she's posing for famous artists. And I absolutely loved that scene, and the writing and the first chapter in general was so beautiful. I could have read it over again in its own right. And the writing in this was so beautiful too. To start with, Angela Carter was a magnificent writer, and this is some of the best writing I've read in a really long time. And so we started with Melanie exploring herself, and then you see her, desiring to be married perhaps, but also I think she's debating whether she wants to be married or whether she really just wants to have sex. But even in this time period, there was just a lot of pressure for women and a lot of moral codes and stuff like that. And at one point, there's a scene that explores her and her siblings going to church, and Melanie likes to pray, "Please God, let me get married or let me have sex." So she's kind of struggling with that. And then because of this one night, she puts on her mother's wedding dress and she goes out into the garden. And it's this weird scene where it's almost like she becomes the bride of life, and she marries the night, she marries everything, almost like a loss of innocence. And then she freaks out. It's all too much for her. It's all too fast. It's all too much. And so she climbs back up the apple tree into her room. It's kind of like Eve climbing back up the tree of knowledge, wishing she never had that knowledge. But it is too late. And the next day, she receives word that her parents have died, and she is sent to live with her uncle, who is a toy maker, her and her 2 siblings. And her uncle's world and the world of the toy shop is so different to what she's used to. It's dark and gritty, and there's something unsettling about it. Her uncle is married, and her aunt's 2 brothers live with her as well. And so Melanie enters a strange world where the uncle is like all that is harsh and cruel, kind of about the patriarchy, and his wife is this woman who's been silent ever since the day she was married. One of her brothers, Finn, Melanie is both attracted to and yet repulsed by his maleness, and she has an interesting relationship with him, and he was a great character. He was like such a sprightly character and almost like a jester or like a fool type character. And so Melanie finds herself, though, loving her aunt and her aunt's 2 brothers more and more, and they kind of form a certain type of bond and family and friendship as Melanie comes to terms with this world. And then things escalate, and her uncle puts on these weird puppet shows, and he wants Melanie to act in place of one of his puppets, where he does this puppet show where he reenacts the rape of Leda by the Swan. And that's a really unsettling scene where it's like her uncle, which seems to represent everything bad about the patriarchy, tries to be the one that takes away her sexuality from her and kind of overpowers her, but it doesn't happen. And then And then all these things happen, some sort of disaster happens, and it's like that world is done away with, and Melanie finds herself in a new world, yet a world where she probably still will somewhat conform to typical women's roles. So yeah, so it was a very odd book. Like I said, very beautifully written and just so fascinating in terms of exploring women's roles and sexuality. And I don't know if it really came to any firm conclusions, but it was just super interesting. And I feel like Angela, and then after reading this, I was like, why did Angela Carter choose to name this The Magic Toy Shop, which sounds like such an innocent book filled of like the wonders of childhood. And I almost think she did it on purpose, kind of teasingly almost, because this book is really about the loss of all of that, the loss of innocence and the loss of childhood instead of the magic and wonder of childhood. So I found that really interesting. And yeah, so I would highly recommend this book, really. I mean, it's one of the best books I've read in such a long time. Just beautifully, beautifully crafted and just so, so fascinating. This is my first time reading an Angela Carter book, and I will totally be picking up more of her work because I have a feeling that I will become a firm fan. The second book I read in January was Skywriting by Word of Mouth and Other Writings by John Lennon. And this was published after John Lennon's death in 1982, and I gave this 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. So my brother got this for me for Christmas because we grew up both being big Beatles fans, and I think he read this a long time ago, so he really didn't remember it or knew whether it would be something I would like or not. So the first section was called The Ballad of John and Yoko, and it was some autobiographical writings about John's relationship with Yoko, his breakup from the Beatles, some of his spiritual beliefs and perhaps creative processes, you could say, and some of his involvement with revolutionaries in America. And I really enjoyed that section. I mean, I just really like John Lennon as a person, and so it was really cool hearing in his own words some of his thoughts. And I wrote down a lot of quotes from that section as well that I posted on my Tumblr. So that part was really cool. But then the majority of this book was the section entitled Skywriting by Word of Mouth, and it's very bizarre, whimsical writing. Nonsensical writing. Like, I couldn't even begin to tell you what that section was about. It was too bizarre and too weird. A lot of the wordplay was super clever. I mean, it was just filled with wordplay after wordplay. And I feel like it showed that John Lennon was quite a clever person, and so you could kind of appreciate that. And just like, I don't know what was going on in his brain, to be honest. But yeah, so I like somewhat appreciated it, perhaps mostly because I am a John Lennon fan, but it was too weird, too bizarre to really make sense of. So I don't know. I like partly recommend this. Like, I think the first part's really cool, especially for any John Lennon fans, but the second part, like, I don't know, you'd have to be, like, a hardcore fan to want to read that, or really into, like, and I like bizarre things. I mean, it's, like, so bizarre, you just won't even know what it's about. And if you like an extreme amount of strange wordplay and bizarre scenes, that's, like, a drug trip, and you really won't be able to figure it out. Yeah, so I don't know. I recommend this cautiously. Third book I read in January was Ship of Destiny, which is written by Robin Hobb and published in 2000, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. So this is the third and final book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy, and that trilogy is the second trilogy in like this larger overarching series called The Realm of the Elderlings. And I loved this conclusion to the Live Ship Traders, and I'm just such a firm Robin Hobb fan, such a firm fan of the Realm of the Elderlings in general. And the Live Ship Traders stole my heart just as much as the Farseer trilogy did. I've given every single one of these books 5 stars, so that can tell you how much I love them. So this is a fantasy series, if you didn't know. And the second trilogy, The Live Ship Traders, in particular follows seafaring people. You know, there are sailors, traders, pirates, sea serpents, and dragons. So lots of exciting things going on in there. And yeah, and I just loved this conclusion to the series. I don't know. This may have been my favorite book in the series. The first one, it's like I wasn't sure if I knew whether I would love it, but I saw it as having fantastic world building, wonderful characters. The second one I loved, and this one just absolutely, completely fell in love with, and I was really sad to leave these characters behind and hope some of them show up in future books. I won't go in some of my other videos, I won't maybe get too much into depth about some of the characters in this series, but this is the third book, so if you haven't read this series, you won't know what I'm talking about anyway, so I won't really go into it any further. I will just say that these series have such fantastic world building and such wonderful characters that just really make you fall in love with these books. And yeah, and this trilogy in particular, it tackled ways in which this world needed to change. This fantasy world, it tackled gender equality issues, issues like rape, slavery, unfair leadership, probably greed, how people treat those that are different than themselves, how people treat other creatures, and what else? Also, I felt like physical deformity and physical difference kind of played a big part in this trilogy and acceptance of that, and I thought that was really cool too. Yeah, and how this links up to the Farseer trilogy and what I think the Realm of the Elderlings kind of is about generally so far, is kind of that this world, the Realm of the Elderlings, it needs to change. It can't go on as it is, and so these different characters, you know, going through that and changing things. And you know, I feel like it's a commentary on our own world too, and things in the past that have not worked, things that are still going on that don't work, and then even our own world can't really go on as it is and needs to change, and it's just explored through a fictional fantasy universe. Yeah, and overall, this series, you know, is about embracing who you are and your destiny. That the world isn't going to change if you don't step into that. Cherishing and embracing your connection to other people, accepting those that are different from you. Same with the creatures and the world around you. You know, animals, other fantasy creatures that are similar to animals, I suppose. And yeah, and just some of the issues that aren't right, and embracing your connection to everything. I don't know. So that's cool. I mean, it's definitely unfolding, and the meaning of it and what's going on really in this world is unfolding as I go. But I'm really liking just those overall themes, and both these trilogies were fantastic, and I loved this conclusion. And I will be reading the third trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings, the Tawny Man trilogy, soon. I think I'm going to start it next month in March. I took February off to read some other things because I was reading a lot of these books. Fourth book I read in January was Trilby by George du Maurier, and this was published in 1894, I think. Let me see. I'm not sure. Yes, 1894. And I gave this 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. So, George du Maurier is rather an interesting figure because he was the grandfather to some very famous people. So, if you've heard of the novelist Daphne du Maurier, George du Maurier was her grandfather, and George du Maurier was also the grandfather of the children that inspired Peter Pan, if you've heard about them. So, very interesting family. And anyway, so this book of his is set in the 19th century bohemian art world of Paris. And it follows three artists and their relationship with an artist model named Trilby, and then Trilby turns into an opera star aided by a sinister man named Svengali. So, in terms of this being a depiction of the 19th century bohemian art world in Paris, this was really wonderful and interesting. Besides painters and such, you see, and art models, you see musicians, and they discuss the literature of the time and just the theater world and opera, the opera world in particular. Um, and that was really cool and definitely like a nostalgic nod by the author to that kind of setting, like the artistic world of his youth, because I think he kind of was an artist for a while, and he even did the illustrations in here, which were pretty cool. Let me see if I can find one. I don't know. I want one where somebody's painting, perhaps. Okay, oh, here we go. There's, I think, Trilby who's posing. Yeah, so this was filled with his drawings, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so that part was cool, and I mean, this novel really didn't have much of a plot. It kind of was just about that, to be honest. In terms of the writing style, it seemed imperfect, and I couldn't love it the whole time. Like, it was very conversational, which is kind of nice. But George du Maurier, he kind of lists things too much, I guess. Like, he would use too many adjectives, you know, instead of just saying, like, it was great. He's like, it was amazing and spectacular and beautiful and charming. And he would do that like every sentence. So that got kind of old and wordy, I guess. It was kind of quirky and endearing, but it made it really unpolished. And there are also so many French, I don't know, sayings, paragraphs throughout the book, like a lot of French. And in some respects, it was kind of fun because I did take French when I was in school. I mean, I don't remember that much of it, but it kind of, you know, tested me a little bit, which I guess was kind of fun. And it really gave a good sense of like the merging of the English and French cultures, which is kind of a big part of this book. And I think George du Maurier in general. But there was plenty of turning to endnotes, which kind of got old and made the reading kind of choppy. Yes, I don't know if I was a fan of the way this was written too much. Like, it was interesting and kind of endearing in a not perfect, unpolished way. Where this book was really interesting was in the exploration of Trilby. Now, not really in the way that her character's fleshed out, because I feel like she's in that fleshed out, just to explore kind of the suppression of female creativity at the time. So when we first meet Trilby, she's very carefree, she's working as an artist model, and she is completely shameless. And then her love interest points out to her that it is a sin to do that. And so she gives up doing that for him. And then for a while she becomes this perfect little example of female, like the female Victorian ideal, I suppose, the domestic female ideal. But then even that comes to an end when she is not allowed to marry her love interest because she is not in the same class as him. And so then she goes off with the sinister Svengali to become an opera star, but he has, I won't spoil anything, but like he has power over her voice and she can't sing without him, even though she has a great voice. So that was really interesting. She kind of loses in every situation. I mean, she's a victim of the class system for sure, but mostly of the gender norms of the time. and her creativity is in men's hands. She's stopped from creativity using her body and being a model by the one she loves telling her that it's a sin. And then she can't really sing without Svengali. The power, the creativity of her voice, the power of her voice is in a man's hands. So besides the suppression of female creativity, and Trilby has a tremendous amount of creative potential that she is not allowed to share. Just this was a great exploration of just the suppression of women's bodies in general and their voices, two things that were very suppressed at the time. And still there are issues today, you know. And in terms of her love interest, Little Billy, there was a lot of interesting exploration around femininity involving him too, because he is rather uncomfortable with femininity, which is interesting because they describe him as being rather small in stature, very effeminate. He is an artist and has pursuits that aren't typically masculine, and this is brought up over and over again, and he's not very athletic and big and strong and stuff like that. They compare him to other characters in the book. So he, in a way, is feminine, and he's uncomfortable with that. And then his mother is very domineering, so he's domineered by this feminine figure. And then he is a rebel and progressive in some ways, but yet the way that he's very traditional is that he likes the Victorian ideal of women, and he is uncomfortable with female bodies and sexuality. So there's that. In the ways he is progressive that I liked, like there was a discussion about religion and how he believes in a higher power, but not religion, and there was a whole discussion about that, and he kind of rebelled from that in a way, and I liked that. So I didn't really like him, but I did like him in one scene discussing religion, but not in the rest of it. So, and I don't know what George de Maurier meant by all of that, but I thought it was a very fascinating exploration of all those things, and it just brought all that up and really made me think about all those things. And then in terms of Svengali, kind of the sinister villain of the book, he was interesting. He possessed powers of mesmerism, and he was very talented, but definitely through the betrayal of him, there were expressed like the anti-Semitic views of the time, and so, you know, just some of the problematic views of the time, and so his character was rather a result of that. Yes, so interesting book. Not perfect, but yet obviously made me think about a lot of things. So I guess if some of those things sound interesting to you, knowing this book isn't perfect though, I do recommend it, but it isn't perfect, so I don't necessarily recommend this to everybody. I wanted to pick this up because I actually work as an art model, and I thought it was so cool that there was a book, you know, a classic following an art model, and I guess it was a little bit depressing reading about what it was like in her time. Yeah, so that was Trilby. Fifth and final book I read in January was The Angels Came by the Spanish author Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and this was published in 2008, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. So this is loosely connected to his novel The Shadow of the Wind, which I believe I read in November, and I absolutely loved it. It became a new favorite book of mine. And so this is only loosely connected. It's set in 20th century Barcelona as well, but set in the period before The Shadow of the Wind. It has a place in common called the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, and there are some characters that link up, just not necessarily the main character, but some side characters link up to characters in The Shadow of the Wind, so that was fun and rewarding to have read them close to each other and The Shadow of the Wind first, so I definitely recommend that. And Carlos Ruiz Zafón is just such a magnificent storyteller. I mean, this was a complete page-turner, just absolutely hooked. His sense of mystery, the gothic atmosphere, the sense of tragedy, yet of love and friendship and redemption, were just so wonderful, and his descriptions of the architecture and just the mood of 20th century Barcelona was just so palpable and really wonderful. So this book in particular follows a writer named David Martin. He has been holed up in his old mansion he lives in, and he's pretty much working himself to death. And so this mysterious publisher named Andreas Corelli comes along and makes him a mysterious offer. He will give him just an enormous sum of money if he will write a book for him. And this book, he basically wants to be a new religion. A book so emotionally convincing that people will be willing to kill for it, to die for it, to adhere to it. And the story goes from there. So, I mean, in a way, on the one hand, this is kind of about David selling his soul in a way. He doesn't necessarily mean it. He's not a bad character. He was very likable, but yet makes some mistakes and is kind of sarcastic and has a bit of a bitter edge. But he sells his soul in a way, and there are repercussions for that, and it causes a lot of tragedy. And kind of at the end of the day, he's offered redemption, but it does come at a price, so he kind of learns his lesson. Yeah, and I will say this book, I mean, The Shadow of the Wind was dark, but I feel like this was a lot darker. And it did have good moments and happier moments, and he did get some redemption, but really not so much like The Shadow of the Wind. What this book talked about that was so interesting, besides the power of narrative in general, I mean, both these books are, in a way, love letters to literature and to the power of fiction, pretty much. But this book really explored the connection between religion and narrative. How religion basically is just composed of different stories and myths and legends that are just fictions that somebody made up, and they are so convincing that people have killed and died for them for thousands of years that societies strictly adhere to, that societies use for their own purposes, to come up with rules and just everything. I mean, so many things have been because of religion, and religions are, well, because of a longing for a connection with a higher power, but the organized religions, are really because of narrative and what that has done and the power of that, and really just making you think about what religion is in general. And I mean, this is something I've thought about a lot, but this book just brought up a new angle to it that I thought was really fascinating. And just really eye-opening. And besides that, there is exploration of just sort of the magic of literature, how books kind of contain like part of the author who wrote them, and that, reading books, he celebrates readers just as much as writers, and shows how important the role of a reader is, and that, no two people read the same book, and that a reader is necessary for a book to come alive, and just the connection between readers and writers, and how, and then he comes to the conclusion, one character comes to the conclusion, like, well, whatever God is, whatever this higher power is, whatever this force of life is, when a book is written, this power is drawn upon, and books are just part of this magic. And perhaps what Carlos Ruiz Zafón is saying is to not believe in the power of organized religion, but to just believe in the power of narrative. Because this guy sure likes fiction, and as much as I do, so I love that. And yeah, so another fantastic book by him. I think I love Shadow of the Wind more, but it's hard to say because I loved this so much too. There are two more books that kind of link up in this loose series. Only one of them is published in English though so far, so I will definitely be reading that one. Hopefully the fourth one gets published in English soon because I'm addicted and I have found a new favorite author. And yeah, I will say The Shadow of the Wind, it really just, no, like spoke to my heart. Like I just reading it was such an emotional experience, and just reading it straight from my heart, if that makes sense. Like where this one was a little bit more intellectual. While it touched my heart, it was a little bit more intellectual and got me thinking more. Um, yeah, anyways, I highly recommend these books. I really think everyone should read Shadow of the Wind though first, and then read this one. So those were all the books I read in January. Actually, quite a good reading month because all of those were actually quite good. Um, if you want to read full-length written reviews of all the books I've read, I'll link both my Tumblr and my Goodreads below. On Tumblr, I post quotes as well, so if you like that sort of thing. Sometimes I post a lot, sometimes I don't. Um, yeah, and I will also link my Patreon account below if you would care to support me. I do have a few patrons at the moment, and so thank you all very much. Super appreciate it. And yeah, I still want to make a video of my favorite books of 2018, but we'll see when I find the time. It just might be really late, but hopefully at some point in time. Yeah, other than that, I'll see you next month for my February wrap up. Bye, everyone.